I'll tell you what. Why don't we make a fidget spinner out of exotic wood?
Wood.
Alright, so the first thing I do is cut out my template. I actually drew this up in Google SketchUp, so there should be a link to that file, that PDF, in the description. But once I got it cut out, I grabbed my board. I'm actually using yellow heart for this project. This is 1/2 inch thick. And then I also have some pretty dark Ipe veneer, which I'm going to use kind of as the outer skin. And I'm using here kind of a CA glue trick where I spread it out and then I hit the other side with activator, and it pretty much glues it almost instantly as soon as I press it down, which is only really usable for smaller projects. You don't want to definitely use this for like a bigger project as it just won't work. But I'm kind of going for like a yellow jacket effect, so I like the dark on yellow, and I hope that it will kind of be a good contrast. And then I just take the template and spray some spray adhesive on and just stick it right to the piece of wood. And then my initial plan was to just drill these side holes, which will eventually become these side accents. I ended up changing my mind later on, but you'll see later. But for right now, I'm just drilling the holes, 2 on each side, just to kind of be a, like an accent. I had to clamp a board onto the side to get the final hole drilled up or centered up on with a brad point bit. Then I'll take it over the miter saw, and basically I'm just going to sneak up on each cut. I'm not going to make the final cut on the first one. You see I'm going to make several passes and just shave off a hair each time. These should be 30 degree cuts, but if it doesn't line up with the template, maybe the template was slightly off, you definitely want to line up with the template and not just go with a 30 degree cut. And the last cut I actually had to adjust the angle ever so slightly off of 30 degrees just to get it to perfectly line up with the template. There's kind of a fine line between cutting too fast, which would give like tear out on the veneer and just not a smooth surface, and cutting too slow, which would burn the wood. So I found if you kind of sneak up on the line and take several passes, it kind of eliminates both of those problems because it gives a very clean edge because you're taking off a very light pass. But since you're cutting fast enough for the very last pass that it doesn't burn the wood, so it just helps to sneak up on the cuts. And you'll also notice I'm using kind of a homemade fence. I definitely would not attempt getting this close to the blade without a custom fence that'll give you some support. Otherwise it's just kind of too close for comfort. Next I'm going to just quick drill an 1/8 inch pilot hole right in the center. Make sure everything's centered up according to the template. And then now that I've got that hole drilled, I'll just take the template off, use mineral spirits to loosen up the adhesive. It's kind of a two-phase process, one to peel the actual paper off and the other one to actually release the adhesive and clean it up. I found that using a small pilot hole really helps, especially these cheap Forstner bits that come in a kit, multiple set. If you just have the center hole pre-drilled, it just helps them cut a lot faster because usually a lot of times it's the weakest link is the very center of the bit. But here I'm cutting a countersink hole. Basically it's because the bearing is thinner than the 1/2 inch piece of wood that I'm drilling. We want the bearing to be centered, so we had to countersink it. So with the center hole for the bearing is the most important hole, and it should be 22 millimeters because that's how big the outer diameter of the bearing is. And a lot of the drill bit manufacturers will just kind of say, oh, it's close enough, and they call 7/8 equivalent to 22 millimeters, when actually, if they're honest, some of them I noticed they'll say 22.2 because it's not actually a metric bit. It's just a 7/8 inch bit that they're giving the metric equivalent to. The ideal is if you use a 22 millimeter Forstner bit for the center hole, which I didn't have. I was just kind of doing this on a whim, so I just used a 7/8 inch bit, and it was slightly too big, and it kind of led to complications later on down the line, which I'll get to. But for right now, I just used a 7/8 inch Forstner bit for the center bearing. And this is where I made my first mistake because I did not take into account that the countersink was under there, so the bottom was unsupported, so it led to some tear out, which thankfully is going to be covered up anyway. But by the by the handle or the button, but it was just, you know, a small little oversight. And then at this point, I'm just going to veneer the sides, again using the CA glue and activator method that I used for the face grain of the spinner. And I'm just sanding it, cutting with a veneer saw, and just a lot of sanding. But I think it's worth it in the end. Even though it kind of complicated things to have a veneer, it does add, I guess, a nice level of contrast. And I also made a design change. I got rid of those small little holes and I just changed it to a notch, like a triangular notch. So I used a V-groove bit to make those grooves instead of the semicircle. Then I used that same bit to chamfer all the edges, and this actually exposed, cut through the veneer and exposed a little bit of the yellow heart, which is what I wanted. And it gives a nice kind of a contrasty look to the edges, which I really like. Next, I'm drilling all the corners with an 8mm bit so that I can tap it. I'm going to use a 3/8 inch tap, and I'm actually boring out just about all the way down to where the center bearing hole is. So it's a pretty deep hole, and that's so that I can get the maximum amount of weight in with a set screw. But you'll notice here, when I start to tap it, it really just wrecks the veneer on the very corner. It just tears up a little bit, so I eventually ended up just sanding that off and going with a bare yellow heart edge, because the thread tap just was not kind to the veneer. But just keep in mind that you're tapping end grain, which is kind of a no-no. So I used some thin CA glue once I had the pilot hole drilled, and also once I had the threads cut. And I had to actually cut them multiple times, just in and out multiple times, just to make sure it's really smooth and fully cut. But in a lot of cases, people would say, oh, well, now it's done because we have a bearing and it spins. But it's far from it, because it really is not functional as is. We need to make some buttons, some handles for it. So that's where the lathe comes in. So I'm just doing some lathe work here. This is pretty basic stuff, but my initial thought was to use yellow heart and kind of just make a dished button that's kind of scalloped in the middle, so that it just kind of fits your thumb a little better, or your finger a little better. But I ended up scrapping that design later on, you'll see. I found it was really hard to drill a flat bottomed hole at this size and depth, because it's just a really small piece and it was a brad point bit. So I ended up just saying, forget it, I'm just going to do a through hole, and then the carbon fiber tube is going to be exposed in the end. So just use a Dremel, cut off a small little section of carbon fiber tubing, which is really going to tie everything together right in the middle. It's going to fit in the bearing. For a finish, I used boiled linseed oil. Just wanted something that's simple, not too, glossy that could get banged up, but just something that would give it a natural look. Just planning ahead that it's probably going to get kind of banged up anyway, so might as well keep it kind of satiny look. Now for the bearings, I just had these are 608 bearings. This is actually a seized up bearing from a bandsaw that I had, so I had to clean it out really well. Just used WD-40. Just a lot of junk that came out of them. You can use like a knife or like a little screwdriver to pry open the shield, but here I just had to clean it many times just to get all the sawdust and junk out of there. But eventually I got it spinning really well, and I used some denatured alcohol to clean out the oil and just get it really smooth running. So then I mount the rod in the vise, and I just set the bearing right in place, and I found it was not really sticking in with friction. I mean, I could just push it in with my hand, so it's easy to push out. So I used thin CA glue to glue it actually into place. This is the downfall, I guess, of using a 7/8 inch bit versus 22mm bit. But I'm actually being very careful here not to get any of the thin CA glue in the bearing, otherwise it would basically just ruin it right away. So I'm allowing it to be wicked into the gap. I'm putting it on the wood and having it wick into the gap between the wood and the bearing. Now I fit the handles on the same way. I'm just making sure that nothing rubs, not putting it in too deep that it's touching the bearing, so it's just a little bit offset. And actually going back, I probably would have put a 5/16 inch washer between the handle and the bearing just to give it a little bit extra space. Then I can just put in the 3/8 inch set screws and then screw them in. And then I can test the balance of it by holding it vertically and then spinning it, and you'll just see when it stops spinning, the heavier side wants to kind of gravitate toward the bottom. And when that happens, that's when the adjustable set screw comes in handy, because you can move them in. It has the effect of decreasing the weight and moving it out away from the center of gravity, which has the effect of increasing the weight in that corner until the corner's basically, when it stops spinning, it's just perfectly level and doesn't offset to one side. And then at this point, I kind of made a design change. I decided that the buttons with the light colored wood and then the center hole just looks like Tinker Toys, which is not a good look. So I decided to carefully sand it flat and just veneer it with the Ipe veneer that I had. And just a lot of sanding, a lot of work in this because it's just kind of like a mistake that I made where I wanted to fix it and make it look a little better. But in the end, this design really has a lot of wood. It just shows off the wood really well. It just has a lot more exposed wood grain versus the traditional fidget spinner design. So the trick is to move the weight into the sides of the unit instead of on the front, which would obscure the wood grain. And that's done with set screws, or you could almost even just use like a brass rod or any kind of, I guess, metallic thing that has a lot of weight to it. That way it just keeps the front clear and unobstructed from the wood grain.
Let's fire this bad boy up.